Commander Elena Torres was known for her fierce reputation. In the world of high-stakes military operations, she had earned respect through her sharp mind, exceptional skill, and unshakable calm. Yet, no matter how high her rank or how many battles she had won, Elena still found herself fighting a different battle, one against prejudice. She had grown accustomed to people underestimating her based on her mixed heritage. She knew the challenge of proving herself in a world where her abilities mattered less than the color of her skin or her gender. That afternoon, Elena was driving alone through a small, quiet town. Her mind was focused on a mission briefing she'd just completed. It was routine for her, a sharp, calculated mind always working, always planning. As she turned down a side street, the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser appeared in her rearview mirror. She sighed but pulled over to the side of the road. Elena knew she hadn't been speeding, and her vehicle was in perfect condition. The town was small, and she didn't recognize the officers in the cruiser. She assumed it was just a random check, something that happened from time to time. Still, her heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from experience. She had been stopped many times before. Some cops treated her with respect, others with disdain. She had learned how to handle both. The officer who approached her window was tall, with a solid build, wearing a look of suspicion on his face. His partner stood a few feet behind him, arms crossed and eyes narrowed. Elena knew exactly what they were thinking before they even said a word. They were judging her before they knew anything about her. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the officer said, his voice flat. "Do you know why we pulled you over?" Elena's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. "No, officer. I wasn't speeding, and my lights are working fine." The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he eyed her up and down, his gaze lingering a little longer than necessary. Elena had faced this many times before, judgment based on her appearance. She had learned to keep her expression neutral, her tone calm. "Do you have any ID, ma'am?" he asked, almost as if the question was an afterthought, his eyes still scanning her face. Elena didn't flinch. She reached into the glove compartment and handed over her driver's license, along with her military ID, knowing it would catch his attention. She had no intention of explaining anything to them unless absolutely necessary. The officer took both and glanced at them, his eyebrow raising slightly as he studied her military ID. "Commander Torres," the officer read aloud. His voice was laced with disbelief, as though he wasn't sure what to make of the title. "Military, huh?" His tone was almost mocking now. "What does someone like you do in the military?" Elena's eyes narrowed, but she remained calm. She knew exactly what he was implying. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her presence in the military, but it still stung every time. People often assumed she was there because of some special treatment or tokenism. She had earned her place, but there were always those who doubted her. "I'm a commander. I lead soldiers in the field," Elena said simply, her voice steady and unyielding. The officer glanced at his partner, who had taken a few steps closer, seemingly intrigued by the conversation. His partner smirked, and Elena could see the judgment in his eyes. It wasn't just curiosity, it was disdain, a belief that someone like her didn't belong in such a position. "So, what's a commander like you doing in a town like this?" the first officer asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Elena could feel the tension in the air, but she refused to let it affect her. She knew all too well that these kinds of situations could escalate quickly, especially with people who were quick to judge. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel and kept her back straight. She wasn't afraid. She was just exhausted from having to deal with this over and over. "I was passing through," Elena replied coolly, her mind already racing. She knew the officer would try to dig deeper, to find some reason to make this encounter last longer. The officer stepped back slightly, looking over her car as if expecting to find something wrong. His partner leaned in, still watching her closely, clearly trying to make her feel uncomfortable. "What's your full name, Commander?" the first officer asked. Elena could see the way he was trying to test her patience, trying to provoke her into showing some sort of reaction. "Elena Torres," she said calmly, "but you can call me Commander." The officer hesitated for a moment, as if unsure of how to proceed. His partner, meanwhile, had started to make a show of inspecting the back of her car, moving around it slowly, as if looking for something to criticize. Elena didn't flinch. She had learned that staying calm and composed was the best strategy, especially in situations like this. "So, what, you think you're above the law or something, Commander?" the officer suddenly asked, his voice rising with a clear note of aggression. Elena's calmness was her armor, and she didn't let it slip. She had been in situations far more dangerous than this, and she wasn't about to let these two officers push her buttons. Still, she could feel the anger bubbling inside her, just below the surface. She had to keep it in check. "I think I'm above treating people unfairly based on assumptions," Elena replied, her voice measured but firm. For a moment, there was silence. The officers exchanged a glance, and Elena could tell they were taken aback by her confidence. They had expected her to flinch, to get defensive, to let their words provoke her. But she wasn't like the people they were used to dealing with. One of the officers finally spoke again, but his voice had lost some of its earlier edge. "Well, Commander, we'll need to run your ID through the system. Just sit tight for a minute." Elena nodded, leaning back in her seat as the officers walked back to their cruiser. Her mind was racing. She knew this wasn't over yet. She could feel the tension in the air, a weight that seemed to press down on her shoulders. But she wasn't afraid. She had faced much worse and come out on top. This was just another challenge to face, one that she would overcome. As the officers sat in their cruiser, Elena's thoughts drifted back to the many times she had been underestimated. She had faced more than just prejudice. She had faced death, betrayal, and sacrifice. She had fought for her place in the military and earned every inch of respect she had. Now, it seemed she would have to fight again, but this time, it was for something even more important, her dignity. Elena sat silently, her hands resting on the steering wheel, her posture still. The officers were sitting in their patrol car a few feet away, doing what they had to do, running her ID through the system. It was a routine check, but Elena could feel the tension building. It was not the first time she had been unfairly targeted, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. She looked out the windshield, letting her mind wander for a moment. The town was quiet, too quiet for her liking. The distant hum of a car engine broke the silence as another vehicle drove past. Elena's thoughts turned inward. She'd worked so hard to get to where she was. Every promotion, every mission, every medal, she had earned them through sheer will and determination. Yet, here she was, sitting in a small town, dealing with cops who thought she was just another minority who didn't belong in the military. The officer had been quick to judge her, to assume that her presence on the road was a threat. But Elena wasn't just anyone. She wasn't the kind of person who could be easily written off. Her reputation, earned over years of rigorous training and dangerous assignments, was not one that could be dismissed with a glance. "Commander Torres, you got a minute?" the officer's voice cut through her thoughts, and she looked up to see him walking back toward her, his partner following closely behind. There was a new, almost smug, look in the officer's eyes, and Elena could tell that whatever came next wouldn't be easy. She rolled down the window slowly, making sure not to give them any reason to escalate the situation. The officer handed her back her military ID and driver's license, his fingers brushing against the paper as if handling something valuable. "We ran your ID, and everything seems fine," he said, though his tone lacked any sense of genuine respect. "But we've got a few more questions. Just routine stuff. You know how it is." Elena's eyes met his. She didn't flinch. She didn't even move. Routine stuff? Like asking me if I'm above the law, she replied, her voice calm but firm. The officer's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of annoyance flashing in his eyes. "We're just making sure you're who you say you are," he said quickly, trying to brush off her words. But Elena wasn't going to let him off that easily. She knew the game he was playing. He was trying to get her to react, to show some sort of weakness. But that was not Elena's style. She had been through far worse situations, battles where the stakes were much higher than a routine traffic stop. "You've already checked my ID. You know exactly who I am," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. The officer leaned in slightly, his face inches from the window. "Commander, what exactly is a woman like you doing out here, alone?" His words were laced with condescension, as though he thought he was entitled to an explanation. "This town's a long way from any military base." Elena kept her gaze fixed on him, refusing to let him see the flash of anger rising in her chest. She had heard this before. The assumption that women in the military didn't belong, the idea that she was somehow out of place in her own skin. It was nothing new, but it still burned every time. "I'm just passing through," she said, her voice low but sharp, letting him know that she didn't owe him any more than that. The officer took a step back, clearly unsatisfied with her answer. His partner, who had been standing quietly behind him, finally spoke up. "Yeah, sure. Just a little strange, don't you think?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Elena felt a familiar anger bubble up. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her, but she fought to keep her calm. She had been in high-stakes situations before, situations where her life and the lives of her soldiers were on the line. This was nothing compared to that, but it still made her blood boil. She had worked her entire life to be respected, and yet, here were two men questioning her simply because of her appearance. The officer continued, "You don't seem like the type to get caught up in stuff like this." Elena knew what he was implying. They thought she was just another woman who didn't belong, another face in the crowd who could be dismissed. They assumed she was weak because she was calm, composed, and confident. But they didn't understand Elena was trained to stay cool under pressure. She had earned the right to be confident, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. "I'm exactly the type to be out here," Elena said slowly, her voice controlled. "I don't need to explain myself to you, but I'll say this, I'm a commander, and I've led soldiers through battles you couldn't even imagine." The officer stiffened, clearly not expecting this kind of response. He glanced back at his partner, as if unsure how to proceed. The partner, who had been watching the exchange with an almost bored expression, now seemed to take a small step forward. Elena noticed the change in his stance, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Commander, it's just a routine stop," the first officer said, his tone softer now. "But we need to make sure everything checks out." Elena kept her eyes fixed on him, not backing down. "I've told you everything you need to know. Now, either you let me go, or you keep wasting both of our time. Your choice." For a moment, there was silence. The two officers exchanged glances, their hesitation palpable. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Elena wasn't just a woman driving through town. She wasn't just a military officer. She was a force to be reckoned with, a commander who had earned every ounce of respect that came her way. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the officer nodded, though the hint of suspicion still lingered in his eyes. "All right, Commander," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier arrogance. "You're free to go. But, next time, try to keep it a little lower key, yeah?" Elena didn't respond. She didn't need to. She simply rolled up her window, put the car into gear, and drove away, leaving the two officers standing there, their confidence shattered. As she pulled away, Elena couldn't help but smile slightly. She had won this round. But deep down, she knew there would be more battles ahead, battles where people would still doubt her, still underestimate her. But as long as she had her mind, her training, and her unshakable resolve, there was nothing that could stop her. And no one would ever forget her name. As Elena drove away from the scene, her mind continued to race. It wasn't just the cop's behavior that bothered her, it was the fact that this sort of thing happened time and time again. Every day, it felt like she had to prove herself over and over again, simply because of the way she looked. Being a woman in the military wasn't easy. Being a woman of mixed heritage made it even harder. She didn't let it get to her anymore, though. She had learned long ago how to build walls around her emotions. In the heat of battle, she could keep a cool head and make life and death decisions in seconds. But dealing with prejudice was something else entirely. It was a daily battle that never ended, a battle where her enemy wasn't some faceless threat but the very people who thought they knew her before she even opened her mouth. As she turned onto the highway, Elena's phone rang. It was General Vasquez, one of the few people who truly understood her. "Commander Torres," his voice crackled through the speaker. "I just heard about the situation. You all right?" Elena took a deep breath, her hands tightening on the wheel as she replayed the encounter in her mind. "I'm fine, sir. Just another day, you know." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then the general's voice softened. "I know, Elena. But you don't deserve to be treated like that. No one does. I want you to know that we're taking this seriously. We'll look into it." Elena shook her head slightly, though the general couldn't see her. "It's not the first time, and it won't be the last. I don't need special treatment. I just want people to do their job and not judge me before they know me." "I understand," General Vasquez said. "But don't let them think they can get away with it. You've earned every right to be in that uniform, and they need to respect that." Elena appreciated his words, but she wasn't sure what good it would do. She had always been the kind of person who didn't need anyone's approval, but the weight of constantly being judged wore on her. She had worked so hard to get to where she was, fighting for every promotion, every recognition, every ounce of respect she earned. Yet it always felt like people were waiting for her to fail, to prove that she didn't belong. "I'll be fine," Elena said, trying to sound more certain than she felt. "I'll handle it." General Vasquez seemed to sense her frustration. "I know you will. But don't think for a second that we're not behind you. Just let me know if you need anything." She appreciated his support, even though she wasn't sure what kind of help she could ask for. She didn't want to be seen as someone who needed pity or extra protection. She was a commander. She handled things her own way. After the call ended, Elena's thoughts lingered on the officers. They didn't even know who they were dealing with. If they had known, if they had truly understood who she was and what she had accomplished, they wouldn't have dared to treat her the way they did. The truth was, Elena didn't always look the part of a military commander. She didn't have the same physical presence as some of her colleagues. She wasn't the tallest or the strongest, but what she had was something far more valuable, a brilliant mind and the kind of tactical genius that made her one of the most feared commanders in the field. She had been through hell, survived battles that others couldn't even comprehend, and come out stronger each time. Her reputation in the military was built on her actions, not her looks. But that didn't matter to the officers she had just encountered. They didn't care about her military record. They didn't care about the lives she had saved or the enemies she had defeated. All they saw was a woman of color driving through their town, and in their eyes, that made her a target. Elena clenched her fists, her jaw tightening. She hated that this was still happening. That men like those officers could look at her and assume they knew who she was. They couldn't see past the surface. They didn't know about the countless hours of training, the years of hard work, the blood, sweat, and tears that had gone into making her the leader she was. But what bothered her the most wasn't the disrespect she had received, it was that this type of behavior was so common. She had spent years working in military operations where lives were on the line, where every decision had real consequences. But the prejudice she faced in situations like this felt just as dangerous. It wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who had ever been judged before they were truly seen. Elena knew she wasn't the only one. There were countless people who had to fight for their place in a world that didn't always give them a chance. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had been looked down upon, everyone who had been underestimated. Her thoughts turned to her soldiers, the men and women who looked to her for guidance. They didn't care about her race or gender, they respected her because of her abilities, because of the way she led them in the field. They trusted her judgment, her experience, and her strength. And that was all that mattered. But there were still people out there who didn't see it that way. People who thought they could belittle her, degrade her, just because of what they assumed she was. Elena let out a deep breath, trying to release the frustration building inside her. She had been through too much to let this kind of thing bring her down. She wasn't going to let the ignorance of a couple of officers change who she was or what she stood for. As she drove on, Elena made a silent promise to herself. She would continue to fight. She would continue to rise above the hatred and prejudice, no matter how many people tried to bring her down. She would keep proving that she belonged, that she had earned every right to be in the position she was in, and that no one could take that away from her. The officers hadn't seen it yet, but they would. They would learn that Elena Torres was not someone they could ignore or dismiss. She was the most feared commander in the field, and nothing, not even their racism, could change that. Elena's mind was still racing, but now her thoughts were clearer. As she drove further from the town, the tension in her shoulders started to ease. It had been a while since she'd had to deal with something so petty. The officers hadn't just tested her patience, they'd underestimated her. It wasn't a surprise, people often did. But Elena wasn't the type to let slights like this slide by. Her calm demeanor during the confrontation had served her well, but she was far from the soft target they had imagined her to be. What the officers didn't know was that Elena was used to handling far more dangerous situations than a roadside encounter. Their insults and their assumptions were nothing compared to the pressure she had faced in battle. In the military, Elena had been trained for the impossible. She had faced life or death situations, gone on missions where every second mattered, and dealt with threats far more dangerous than two prejudiced cops. But it wasn't just her experience that made her stand out, it was her ability to think in high-pressure situations. It was her ability to control the situation, to turn the tide when everything seemed lost. She knew the situation with the officers wasn't over. She could feel the weight of their words hanging in the air. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a moment where their assumptions about her had crossed a line. And Elena wasn't about to let them get away with it. As she continued driving, her mind began to work through the next steps. There were protocols in place, ways to address situations like this. She had the power to make sure those officers knew they couldn't just treat people like that without consequences. She had been calm, but now it was time for them to face the reality of their actions. The following day, Elena decided it was time to take action. She knew she couldn't let this go. She had too much at stake, not just her reputation, but the respect of the soldiers under her command. If she didn't do something about this, what kind of message would that send? Elena walked into her office, her boots echoing against the cold concrete floors. The room was quiet, filled with the weight of her thoughts. She took a seat at her desk, the worn wood familiar beneath her fingertips. As a commander, she had always prided herself on keeping a level head. But today, something felt different. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from General Vasquez, I've already spoken with the local authorities. We're putting in a formal complaint. But we want to hear your side of the story first. Let me know when you're ready to talk. Elena exhaled slowly. She knew this wouldn't be easy. But she had made a promise to herself and to the soldiers she led. She would not let this slide. After a brief moment of reflection, Elena called Vasquez. "Sir," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to give my statement." "Good," the general replied. "I know this isn't easy, but it's important that we handle this with professionalism. It's not just about what happened with those officers, it's about sending a message. We have to make sure this doesn't happen again." Elena nodded even though he couldn't see her. "I'll make sure of that." They discussed the details, and Elena made it clear she wasn't just going to file a report and walk away. She had seen enough injustice in her time to know when things needed to change. She would not be the kind of person who ignored the small wrongs, hoping they would disappear on their own. No, she would stand up for what was right. As soon as the call ended, Elena stood and walked over to the window of her office. The view wasn't much, just rows of buildings and the distant hills. But Elena didn't need a grand view. She just needed clarity. She needed to know what came next. The next few hours passed quickly as Elena worked through the paperwork required to file the complaint. She didn't take any pleasure in it. It wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. Those officers had broken protocol. They had let their personal biases influence their judgment. And that wasn't something she could let go. Later that afternoon, Elena's phone rang again. This time, it was the head of the police department in the small town. The man sounded nervous, as if he were walking on eggshells. "Commander Torres, I wanted to personally apologize for the way your situation was handled yesterday," he said. "I've spoken to the officers involved, and I'm taking immediate action. We're reviewing the incident thoroughly." Elena listened, her face expressionless. "I appreciate the apology, but words aren't enough. I need to see real action. This kind of behavior can't be ignored." The police chief agreed. "Of course, Commander. You have my word that we'll handle this appropriately. We'll be in touch with you once the investigation is complete." Elena's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "I'll be waiting," she replied coolly. "And just so we're clear, this is not over. I'll be watching how you handle this." After the call ended, Elena felt a sense of accomplishment, but there was no joy in it. This was just the beginning. She knew that the officers involved would be dealt with, but there was a bigger picture here. It wasn't just about these two men. It was about the system as a whole. It was about changing the way people thought, the way they acted when they saw someone different from themselves. That evening, as Elena sat in her office alone, she reflected on everything that had happened. She had been calm, professional, and strong. She had handled the situation in a way that most people couldn't. She had turned the power dynamic on its head, showing the officers that it wasn't their assumptions that mattered, it was her actions. And now, they were the ones who had to answer for their behavior. In her mind, Elena saw the battlefield once again. But this time, the fight wasn't against an enemy on the other side. It was a fight for respect. And she would win it, one step at a time. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She already had. But she would keep proving that no one could look down on her or anyone else without facing the consequences. This was her fight, and she was ready for whatever came next. Elena turned off the lights in her office and walked out into the quiet night. She had won this round, but the war for respect was far from over. And she was ready for every battle that lay ahead. The next morning, Elena woke up with a quiet resolve. She had taken a stand, but the real work was just beginning. The night had given her little sleep, as the weight of what had happened still sat heavily in her chest. She had been through difficult situations before, missions where lives hung in the balance, decisions that would determine success or failure. But this felt different. It wasn't just about her. It was about showing that change was possible, that prejudice and ignorance wouldn't stand unchallenged. Elena dressed quickly, preparing herself for what would come next. She wasn't expecting the day to be easy, but she knew it was necessary. As a commander, she had faced battles where the odds were stacked against her, but she had always emerged victorious. This would be no different. She would face this challenge head-on and make sure it was known that people like those officers would not get away with treating others like they did. Her phone buzzed just as she finished getting ready. It was General Vasquez. "Commander Torres," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I wanted to check in and see where you stand. The police department is moving forward with an investigation into the officers. But I need you to understand, this isn't just about getting them in trouble. This is about making sure no one else has to go through what you did." Elena nodded even though he couldn't see her. "I understand, sir. It's not about revenge. It's about accountability." "Exactly," Vasquez replied. "We'll make sure this gets the attention it deserves. But the most important thing is what happens next. We need to send a message." Elena felt a spark of determination grow inside her. She had always been a woman of action. She had fought in wars, led troops, and survived when others would have crumbled. She wasn't going to let this small-town incident define her, but she would use it as a way to bring about change. "I'll make sure of that," Elena said, her voice steady. "I'm not backing down." "Good," Vasquez said. "We're with you every step of the way." The call ended, and Elena stood for a moment in silence, looking at her reflection in the mirror. She had to be strong. She had to remain focused on the bigger picture. If she didn't take action now, if she didn't follow through, she knew the disrespect she'd faced would only continue to haunt her. And it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been underestimated, mistreated, or judged without cause. She took a deep breath and left her apartment, heading straight to the local police station. She wasn't sure what kind of reception she would get, but she knew one thing: she wasn't walking out without a clear answer. She had already made it clear to the department that this wasn't just some minor issue, it was about making sure the officers involved knew their actions had consequences. When she arrived, the police chief was waiting for her. His face was tight, but he managed a professional smile as she walked in. "Commander Torres, thank you for coming," the chief said, his tone a little too polite for Elena's liking. "I want to assure you that we are taking this seriously." Elena stood tall, her arms crossed over her chest. "I'm glad to hear it, Chief. But talk is cheap. I need to see real actions. I've already given my statement, and I want to know what's being done about it." The chief's eyes flickered with unease, but he quickly regained his composure. "We've already suspended the officers while we conduct a full investigation. They've been informed that their actions were unacceptable, and we're reviewing their conduct. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again." Elena studied his face, searching for any hint of insincerity. She had been around long enough to recognize when someone was simply saying what they thought she wanted to hear. But the chief's words seemed genuine enough. Still, she wasn't about to let her guard down. This was just the beginning, and she couldn't afford to relax until she knew the officers would face real consequences. "I hope you understand, Chief, that this isn't just about them," Elena said. "It's about the system. It's about making sure that no one, no matter who they are, has to endure what I went through. We need to hold people accountable." The chief nodded, though there was a slight tension in his posture. "I do understand, Commander. And we are working to ensure that this doesn't reflect poorly on the entire department." Elena could tell he was being truthful. But there was still something in the back of her mind that made her wonder. She had been through enough battles to know that sometimes words could be hollow, and actions were the only thing that mattered. "Good," Elena replied, her voice firm. "But I need to hear that loud and clear. Not just from you, but from everyone in this department. Racism and prejudice have no place here. It's up to you to make sure that message is sent, not just to these officers, but to the entire community. The chief nodded again, though this time his face seemed more resigned than defensive. We'll do what it takes, Commander. Elena knew this wasn't going to be easy. There would be pushback, and there would be those who would try to downplay what had happened. But she wasn't going to let that happen. She wasn't going to let anyone forget the lesson learned from this. As Elena left the station, the weight of what had happened still lingered, but she felt a little lighter. She had spoken up. She had done her part to make sure that the officers understood their actions would have consequences. She wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but she was confident that it would lead to something better. The fight for justice didn't end here. She knew that. But as long as she had breath in her lungs, she would continue to fight. She would continue to stand up for what was right, for what was fair. Elena wasn't just a commander. She was a force. And this was only the beginning. The next few days passed slowly for Elena, but each moment felt like a step towards something bigger. Her actions had started a chain reaction, one that was slowly gaining momentum. As much as she wanted to focus on the task at hand, she couldn't ignore the weight of everything that had happened. It wasn't just about one encounter with two officers, it was about something much larger. It was about proving that prejudice had no place in the world she was trying to build, a world where people were judged not by their appearance but by their character. Elena knew she couldn't change everything at once, but the ripple effect was undeniable. She could already see small signs of change, little victories that were impossible to ignore. The police chief had been quick to apologize and take action, but what mattered now was whether that action would have a lasting impact. Would the officers involved learn from their mistakes, or would they return to their old ways? Elena's phone buzzed early one morning. It was a message from General Vasquez. Commander, just wanted to check in. The department is moving forward with the investigation, and I've been told the officers involved will face disciplinary actions. I know you're probably feeling the pressure right now, but stay strong. We're behind you. Elena read the message and nodded, even though no one could see her. She appreciated the general's support, but it was still hard to shake the feeling that there was more to be done. The officers' actions hadn't just been disrespectful, they had been dangerous. Prejudice was like a silent virus, spreading quietly, poisoning everything it touched. One small mistake could turn into something much worse if left unchecked. She wasn't the type to sit back and wait for things to get better. She had spent too much of her life fighting, proving herself, pushing through the tough moments. This wasn't the time to relax, this was the time to take action, to make sure that what had happened wouldn't happen again. Elena made her way to the base the following morning, her mind filled with thoughts of the next steps. The sound of boots echoing in the hallway brought her back to reality. As she entered her office, she was greeted by one of her trusted lieutenants, Captain Harris. "Commander," Harris said with a salute, his voice serious. "We've received word that the officers involved in your incident have been suspended. The department's making sure that this is handled with the seriousness it deserves." Elena nodded but didn't smile. "It's a step in the right direction, but it's not enough. I want to make sure this doesn't just fade into the background. I want a public statement. I want people to know that this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been overlooked, underestimated, or discriminated against. This has to be more than just a punishment. It has to be a wake-up call." Captain Harris raised an eyebrow. "You want to go public with this? It might stir up some controversy." "I don't care about controversy," Elena said firmly. "I care about making sure people understand that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Not now, not ever. If we let it go, it's just going to keep happening. And we've seen enough of that already." Harris nodded, clearly understanding where Elena was coming from. He was no stranger to the kind of battles she fought, the kind of leadership she displayed. He knew what it meant to fight for what was right, even when the odds were against you. "I'll make the arrangements," Harris said. "We'll get the statement ready and prepared. We'll make sure the message gets out there." Elena smiled slightly, but the feeling was fleeting. She knew this wouldn't be an easy fight. It would take time, patience, and a lot of determination. But she was ready for it. She had no other choice. Later that day, Elena found herself in a meeting with the military's public relations team. They discussed the best way to handle the situation, how to make sure the right message got across. It was a delicate balance. On one hand, she wanted to bring attention to the injustice she had faced, but on the other, she didn't want to come across as vengeful or seeking attention. She had to be clear, this was about accountability, not revenge. The conversation was long, but by the end, Elena felt confident in the approach they had agreed on. The statement would be simple, yet powerful, making it clear that this wasn't just about one bad encounter, it was about something much bigger. It was about making sure that racism, prejudice, and injustice had no place in any part of society, whether it was in the military, the police force, or the everyday world people lived in. As they finalized the details, Elena thought about the future. It was one thing to deal with the problem in the moment, but it was something else entirely to work toward long-term change. She didn't want this incident to be a fleeting moment, something that would be forgotten in a few weeks. She wanted it to be the spark that ignited a fire, the beginning of a movement toward a more inclusive, fair, and just world. The statement was released the following day, and within hours, it had spread across news outlets and social media. Elena wasn't one to seek attention, but she knew this moment was important. She needed people to see what had happened and understand the larger issue at play. The public reaction was mixed. Some people applauded her bravery, while others criticized her for making a big deal out of something they thought was trivial. But Elena didn't care about the critics. She wasn't doing this for them. She was doing it for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. The officers involved in the incident were placed on administrative leave as the investigation continued. Elena was told that there would be hearings, and that disciplinary action would follow. But even as she pushed for justice, she knew that there would always be more work to be done. Prejudice didn't just disappear because someone made a statement. It would take time to change the way people thought, the way they acted. It would take time to make the world a better place. But Elena was ready for that fight. She had been fighting all her life, and this battle was no different. This was her mission, and she would see it through. Because if there was one thing she knew for sure, it was that change didn't come from waiting for it to happen, it came from making it happen. And Elena Torres was more than ready to lead that charge. Weeks passed since Elena's statement had shaken the small town, and though the dust had settled, her fight was far from over. It wasn't just about the officers anymore, it was about creating a lasting change, making sure her experience wasn't something to simply be forgotten. She had started something, and now it was up to her to make sure it wasn't a passing moment, but a foundation for something better. As she sat in her office one morning, Elena looked out the window, reflecting on the road that had brought her here. Her thoughts wandered back to the first time she had joined the military. Back then, she had been determined to prove herself, to show the world that she was just as capable, if not more so, than anyone else. She'd spent years fighting battles on the field, where the stakes were life and death. But this was a different kind of fight. This wasn't about bullets or strategy. It was about the very heart of who people were and how they saw each other. She had seen how one small action could start a ripple effect. How speaking up, even when the odds were against her, could lead to real change. But the real victory, Elena realized, wasn't in the headlines or the disciplinary action taken against the officers. The victory would be in the conversations sparked by this moment, in the awareness raised about the things people didn't talk about enough. This fight was about changing minds and hearts, not just punishing wrongdoers. Elena knew that there would be resistance. She wasn't naive enough to think that a single statement would erase years of bias and prejudice. There would be people who would resist change, who would try to downplay the significance of what had happened. But she also knew that, no matter how long it took, change was coming. It was already happening. And she was proud to be part of it. That afternoon, she received a call from the police chief of the town where the incident had occurred. The chief sounded more nervous than usual, which caught Elena's attention. "Commander Torres," he said, his voice laced with hesitation, "I just wanted to update you on the situation with the officers involved. We've completed the investigation, and I want to assure you that the actions taken were serious." Elena leaned back in her chair, listening intently. "Go ahead, Chief," she said, her tone calm but unwavering. "We've decided to terminate the 2 officers involved," the chief continued. "They violated several department policies, and their behavior was unacceptable. We are committed to making sure something like this never happens again, and we've implemented additional training for all officers on cultural awareness and respect." Elena felt a small sense of relief but didn't let her guard down. This was a step in the right direction, but she knew that one firing wasn't going to fix everything. It was a good start, but there was a lot more work to be done. "That's a step in the right direction, Chief," she said, "but it's just the beginning. These officers are being held accountable, but we need to make sure that this message gets out there loud and clear. That this is a wake-up call for everyone. You can't change a culture with one disciplinary action. You have to change the way people think." "I understand, Commander. We're working on it. We'll make sure this incident is used as a teaching moment for the entire department." Elena nodded, her mind already moving to the next steps. "Good. I'll be following up, and I expect to see real change. This isn't just about cleaning up one mistake, it's about creating a culture of respect for everyone, no matter their race, gender, or background." The call ended, and Elena sat in silence for a moment, allowing herself a breath of relief. But her work wasn't over. She had set the wheels in motion, but there was still more to be done. She had always been the kind of person who took charge, who faced challenges head-on. And this challenge was no different. She would continue to lead, to fight, to ensure that what happened in that small town was not in vain. Elena began drafting another statement, one that would encourage others to speak up, to take action when they saw injustice. She wanted to make sure that the ripple effect she had started would continue, spreading to other communities, to other departments, to anyone who needed to hear it. She wanted to use her voice to make sure that this moment would be remembered as the start of something bigger than herself. A few weeks later, Elena was invited to speak at a leadership conference on diversity and inclusion, a topic she had become passionate about. She stood before a room full of military leaders, police officers, and community organizers. The room was packed, and the energy in the air was palpable. This was her chance to push her message even further, to make sure that what she had started wasn't just a local event but a movement that could inspire change across the country. She took a deep breath before stepping up to the podium. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Elena didn't need a script. She knew exactly what she wanted to say. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice steady and confident. "I'm here today not just as a commander, but as someone who has experienced firsthand what it means to be judged before you've even spoken. I'm here because I believe that every person deserves to be treated with respect, no matter where they come from, what they look like, or what they believe. We've seen too many moments where people were discriminated against, dismissed, or disrespected because of their race, their gender, or their background. But today, I'm here to tell you that we can change that. We can create a world where respect is not earned, but given freely to all." The room was still, and Elena could see the faces of those listening intently. She knew she was reaching them. The fight for justice doesn't end with one action, one statement, or one policy change. It's a continuous battle, and it requires all of us to be involved. We have to be the ones to stand up when we see something wrong, to speak out when others can't. It's not just about the people in uniform, it's about everyone who calls this country home. We all have a part to play in making this world a better place for the next generation. Elena paused, letting her words sink in. The officers who mistreated me thought they could get away with it because they didn't see me for who I truly was. But they learned that they couldn't. And now, we're all learning that prejudice has no place in any part of our lives, whether it's in the military, the police, or our communities. The crowd broke into applause, and Elena felt a quiet pride swell within her. This was the beginning of something bigger. It wasn't over yet, but it was moving in the right direction. As she left the stage, Elena knew one thing for certain: the ripple effect she had started would keep growing. And no matter how long it took, she would be there, leading the charge, making sure that the fight for respect and justice never ended. She had started this journey, but now, it was up to all of them. Together, they would change the world.